an aesthetic that was more thoroughgoing. It wasn't just, again, about the big house. And if you look around the site, this is a style and a form that actually then got adopted by the school when the school starts adding buildings to this landscape. And so here's the Belmead store, again, vertical board and batten construction. And these two buildings here are, I think, actually part of another quarter that was part of this. And if you look at the chimney stack on this, that's the one that's going to give it away. So this aesthetic and this set of commitments about the design is actually much more thoroughgoing, and then was also adopted for this, the first shoe and tailor shop that was part of the St. Emma curriculum, part of the education going on here. There's a, here you can see, again, so this building was done in 1899, 1900, right around that period. And these were all just down below the area where there's the washed out bridge as you're coming up the hill. That was the center of the trade school quadrangle. So certainly this notion of reciprocity between buildings and landscapes was central and was clearly an important part of this design. There were other aspects of Koch's relationship to the land that are important. It was not simply an aesthetic sensibility. Koch wrote this book on plantation and farm management in 1852. And he also clearly has, beside this notion of an aesthetic response to the landscape, a notion of the scientific management of the landscape. And so there is a sensibility about the way in which we should deploy our reason and our enlightenment in order to have the land be productive. Philip St. George Koch was the president in the 1850s of the Virginia Agricultural Society, and so again, this sensibility was not simply aesthetic, it was also went to issues of making the land productive. And one of the things that he's suggesting here is how the land should be carefully parceled out in order to encourage the rotation of crops. And so there is, next to this aesthetic and picturesque sensibility, a sensibility about carefully stewarding and looking at the land, figuring out how to rotate crops on the property in order not to exhaust the resources of the land. And this is actually a map that he did for the Belmead site in 1840 that carefully lays out the individual fields on the property and then gives a 5-year rotation of crops. So in field 1 it would go from corn to oats to clover to wheat to clover. And this is again this exercise of scientific imagination about how this land can be made most productive. And I think that is something that we ought to be paying attention to as we think about the kind of education that this property can offer for people going forward. Now, on this 1840 map, you actually have what the site that was the original plantation house site on the Belmead property, which was actually over on the St. Francis side, right along the road where you enter to drive into St. Francis now. What's very interesting about that is the level of detachment from the river. And the river at this time was probably the most civilized section of this area. That was the way in which people traveled through this region most easily. And yet the house is entirely detached from the river, both as a communication system, but also as an aesthetic device. And again, if you think about him dropping the house onto this first hill above the river over on this site here, one of the things that he's clearly doing is reconceiving the aesthetic connections to this site and to the river in a way that clearly the people that had built the prior plantation house were not engaged. They weren't engaged in that picturesque sensibility about this land. So you have, again, this very interesting balance between aesthetics and science on this site. Here's the close-up of the quarter around that house on the map. That was the house that he moves into with his family in 1838. Okay, so that's one. I'm going to go through 5 of these possible lessons. The first has to do with, again, this sense of the architectural and landscape reciprocity, the connection of the two. The other is this theme that Calder and other people have mentioned, which has to do with this site as a self-sustaining site. And to conjure that out, this is out of his out of his personal manuscript books. What this is a double lever tobacco press. And I brought that up in connection with self-sustainability to put onto the table the fact that Koch was clearly not here just to produce food and sustain this local plantation. He was engaged in global trade and global capitalism, which included chattel slavery as an essential element of that. And nevertheless, on this site, it's clear that it was run in a way not only that it would contribute commodities and goods to a global market, but that it was going to draw on the resources of this land to support all of the people that lived on this land. And so they're not only doing tobacco for a broad and global market. The tobacco being pressed into this hogshead on this plantation got put on the canal to go to Richmond, to get put on ships, and was marketed in London. And yet on this site there was a constant calculation about how the resources of this site could be drawn on to support all of the people who were resident of this site. And that is a tradition that continued right through the school times, and again, I think that that's a theme that we need to draw on and think about the way in which the resources of this site can be marshaled to support the mission or the vision of what people are thinking about now. This is one of the drawings that has the overshot water, or the undershot water wheel, with the mill and the sawmill here and the grain mill there, both watered, both powered by the waters of Deep Creek. And we still have, even though these buildings are gone, we still have the vestiges and the physical remains of the harnessing of the local resources in order to support this place, in that we still have on Deep Creek, for example, the dam that was built in 1920 to generate electricity and also generate depiction depiction